Book 3 of the Aeneid could probably be subtitled Aeneas's Odyssey. After spending Book 2 recounting the story of the fall of Troy for Dido, which gives a lot of battle, which gives a lot of harrowing murder and destruction, not unlike the Iliad. It turns then to him being on the run, so to speak, in a kind of wayward journey to find his way home, which is more like the Odyssey. The busyness and the accumulating omens and details, in the sense that, okay, we're definitely going somewhere, but we're not sure how to understand that or what we're going to find when we get there. There's this growing uncertainty of how to read all of these omens and how to interpret all of these details, which brings up a fundamental question about writing itself, or reading itself, and the whole notion of stability and predictability in the world. And that comes out again and again and again in all of these little episodes that just accrue. It's kind of a grab bag. This is, significantly again, this is Aeneas narrating his own story to Dido in the royal court of Carthage. Direct parallel, obviously, to Aeneas among the Phaeacians, where he is somewhat outnumbered and in need of some help, and so he is trying to tell a good story. It's less obviously manipulative than Odysseus' situation. Obviously, Odysseus was all alone and found naked. Aeneas, washes ashore with his warships and his men, and he's just been reunited with a remaining contingent of them. So while they are probably seriously outnumbered in Carthage, it's not really a direct parallel to Odysseus. But he continues to tell the story. Having laid out the story of the fall of Troy, he is now, as I said, on the run and looking for some place to find. He has a vague notion that he has to, according to prophecy, go to Italy and found the city of Rome, or the Empire of Rome. And this will get repeated throughout this book, throughout this chapter. Very early on, you see they have fled Troy, and they're in a community where it's just a wilderness, and they're trying to regroup and assess and say, okay, how do we move forward from there? And it's during a particularly bizarre episode that he pulls up a tree branch or some shrubs or something, and Aeneas recounts, "Soon as I tear the first stalk from its roots and rip it from the earth, dark blood oozes out and fouls the soil with filth." That's kind of weird. Bleeding trees, if you will. The tree turns out to be the embodied with the spirit of the Trojan soldier Polydorus, who he had been sent away by Priam and given lots of gifts and told to go seek refuge in a far corner of the realm. And when he gets there, he is welcomed in until he is killed and robbed of all of his gold, because they realize that, well, okay, Priam's now a goner in the Trojan War. We don't really have to worry about offending him. So he was stuck with spears into the earth, and he turned into this tree, and he needs a proper funeral service in order to rest. And this, of course, brings us back to the episode of Odysseus leaving behind a sailor and having to go back after running into him in the underworld. The idea of funeral services, of recognizing tradition, of custom, performing these rites in a continuous way, even when you are on the run, even if you don't know the person. You have to maintain your traditions. Just like with the Odyssey, the Aeneid is stressing, and probably even more so, stressing the continuity of the tradition. With that, you get they get on the road again. There's a landing. We began to admire Apollo's city when King Aeneas, king of men and priest of the god, his brow wreathed and his bands and holy laurel leaves, comes to meet us, spotting a long lost friend, and Anchises. Clasping our host hands, we file towards his palace, and they go to a shrine to Apollo, and the shrine. Then the voices of the beyond, the voices of the gods, the voices of the spirits of the shrine. I'm not sure how you want to interpret this. Paints a prophecy about the founding of Rome and how they will go on to there your house, search for your ancient mother, ancient homeland. There your house, the line of Aeneas, will rule all parts of the world, your sons, and all their descendants down the years. That notion of sons and progeny and the future, always dangling out there. And sons and fathers and sons play such a key role in this chapter. It's just one more detail that sort of accumulates, and it's a little out of context. There's not a lot of lead up to it, but you're not sure where it's going. You just register that it's there, and okay, well, there's other stuff going on. So, I'll remember that this happened, but then we're on to something else, and I'll get back to that maybe. It's a little bit uncertain what method Virgil is looking for here in terms of interpretation. But they keep sailing. They keep looking for some place to stay. They're told that, okay, they need to go to the land to the west, Hesperia, Italy. They're told again and again that they should not rest until then. They're led down a couple of little dark alleys where they say, well, maybe we could stay here, but no, they land at one place and there's a plague. They land at another, and something else goes wrong. There's always something happening to tell them, no, not here. Don't rest until you find your goal, until you reach your goal. Do not stop. There are going to be a lot of little false starts along the way. One of the more interesting ones comes when he runs on an island occupied by Helenus and Andromache. Helenus is the one of the sons of Priam. Andromache is the widow of Hector. We saw her last in the Iliad, and very moving scene, and she is now a widow. She was sold into slavery, essentially, but she has recentered her life, recreated her life on a small island where they are essentially recreating Troy, but on a much smaller scale. And Aeneas says, as he walks through the city, it looked like a little Troy. Everything was just a little bit smaller, and you get that sense of disapproval from the size. That sense that, well, this isn't quite as good. They're settling, and maybe they shouldn't. It's one more instance of things not quite bearing out, and that they should not stop seeking their homeland. But they keep running into obstacles. They run into one island has the harpies, mythical creatures that are mostly bird but with girl faces, and they're disgusting supposedly. And they get outraged when Aeneas and his men go and slaughter their cattle and to eat. And so the harpies come and they spew ooze all over the meat so that nobody can eat it, and it's disgusting. But again, the cattle is just another callback to the Odyssey and the cattle of the sun, and the idea that these men landed on an island and they ate cattle that they should not have. This is one more little callback to the Odyssey, which is again interesting because we are running into a number of characters in this section in this book that have their callbacks to the Iliad and the Odyssey. We have Scylla and Charybdis making an appearance, and Aeneas sees them kind of off in the distance, says, well, okay, I'm not going to try and go through them. I'm not going to get that curious. I'll just steer clear. They run into Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and he is described as disgusting and, monstrous. And they meet they meet one of Odysseus's, or in this case, Ulysses, crewmen who have been left behind. Supposedly this is coming about just like 3 months after Odysseus came and blinded Polyphemus. And again, you get this instance where they're sort of like hitting on all the bases of the Odyssey, which is going to tingle the curiosity of Dido and her court, and tingle the curiosity of everybody that's familiar with the Homeric poems. So it's good writing in that sense, and he is writing on top. It's a kind of palimpsest where he's writing a text on top of a text. Virgil is. He's saying, okay, well, you all know the Odyssey, so I'm going to just sort of superimpose one more layer on top of it. So while you're hearing about mine, you're thinking about theirs, and you're thinking about Homer's, and you're making all the comparisons and the connections as you go along. And this is a very complicated form of reading that he is relying on in this. Significantly, however, just like with Scylla and Charybdis, where he just sort of like, okay, that's over there, he is not particularly intrigued by, Aeneas is not particularly intrigued by Polyphemus. Remember, Odysseus was really quite driven by curiosity, both to go pursue him and then an ego-driven desire to declare himself, to announce himself afterwards. And he could not let it go. And he very famously and very foolishly told the Cyclops his name, said, I am Odysseus. And that led to all of his trouble with Poseidon and gave him another 10 years of wandering around waiting to get home. So the contrast is so obvious with Aeneas. Aeneas is resisting that temptation. Aeneas is, remember, duty bound. Aeneas does not let anything come between him and his duty, and he's willing to forego his own curiosity, his own assertion of identity in place of or in favor of doing his duty to Rome, to get to Rome and found the city. That surpasses everything. It doesn't matter. He is more taciturn in this instance, let's say. He's a lot less interesting than Odysseus. Odysseus is brilliant. Odysseus is kind of a wild card. Odysseus is always outsmarting people and figuring his things out, and he's very independent in the way he does that. So he's fun to watch. Aeneas, well, less so. Aeneas is the company guy. Aeneas is the reliable one, the duty-bound one, and that is inherently, I would think, not as interesting. There's less conflict involved, for one thing, which conflict drives drama, but also he just, it's just not as much fun to watch somebody who's always going to do the one thing. Not necessarily the right thing, but always going to do what he is supposed to do. He's a color inside the lines guy, and that's fine, but it's not necessarily fun. Right at the end, after you get through, well, as they're on their way, they're always trying to read signs, and a recurrent theme that comes up is the role of fathers and sons and interpretation in general. So these themes are sort of like, swirling around one another, and they start to come into connection with Ascanius, the son of Aeneas, and Anchises, the father. At one point, Anchises brings up the idea of reading and interpretation very explicitly when he talks about a vision of horses and how horses can be seen as or interpreted as a sign of either war, because you ride horses and chariots and go and fight and stuff like that, but also peace, because you can put a horse on or attach a plow to a horse, and it is a dray horse or something like that. So he's saying that, okay, that's kind of your conclusions from a symbol. Your reading of a symbol can be a little unreliable. There is no certain determinant in there. So that's just another little thing that sort of accrues there. And then when they're with Andromache, she singles out little Ascanius, and she gives him something that she has been weaving. She was weaving all throughout the Iliad, and women weave in ancient epic poetry. But she singles out Ascanius, says, how are you? She tips her hat a little bit, saying, well, how have you been since your mother died, or something like that. And she would not have known that his mother had died. But the, editing. But she singles him out and says, okay, I recognize your features from my son, or something like that. I can see him in you. You were so much alike. And now I wouldn't take this literally. I wouldn't say that, well, there's two kids roughly the same age, they look alike. I don't know. I wouldn't take that literally. I would say that is a sign of the special role that children play for these characters, in that they represent the future, and there is a certain privileging of them, and saying that, okay, this is what matters. The whole idea of going to found Rome is not so that they can have some place to just, finally relax. It's all about founding the city, giving birth to a new civilization that will then outlive you. Children represent that, and Ascanius in this is very much the representation of that, just like Anchises represents the tradition that they receive. Remember the famous image of Aeneas carrying Anchises out of Troy on his shoulder while leading his son by the hand, that the future and the past brought together and ushered into the unknown, inextricably bound. Anchises is always about, he is the receiver of tradition. He's often praying. He is often dispensing a kind of wisdom. He is often quite wrong about things, quite frankly. But he recognizes this, and he kind of admits it. It is Anchises who, when they take in the refugee from Odysseus, who's been stuck with the Cyclops for 3 months, it is Anchises who brings him ashore, or brings him on board their ship from the shore, and welcomes him in, practicing Xenia, practicing that kind of forgiveness. And it's almost Christ-like in this, because this is a enemy soldier. This is one of Odysseus's men, Odysseus, who was very much the enemy from the Trojan perspective, and they just bring him in, and Anchises just sees, okay, once he comes, and he very dramatically throws his arms around, I think, Aeneas's knees, which is this sign of supplication in the ancient world. Anchises immediately just says, okay, no, come on, you're with us. recognizing the value of hospitality, welcoming this soldier, this sailor, whatever, into their home. And home is what they're looking for themselves. This whole thing is about homelessness. This whole book is about being homeless and just trying to find some place to call home and to get to some place that they could call home and not be dragged off in all of these other misdirections. Home. And it's Aeneas at the end when Aeneas is relating all these stories and going off on all these tangents. It's Aeneas at the very end that closes the chapter, because after he recounts bouncing around from island to island, getting roughly from Greece into Italy and onto the shores of Sicily, Aeneas comes to the final little part of his story for Dido and her court. Here, after all the blows of storm and sea, I lost my father, my mainstay in every danger and defeat. Spent as I was, you left me here, Aeneas, best of fathers, plucked from so many perils, all for nothing. His father dies. His father, who's been so much a part of his adventure so far, so much a part of his sense of mission so far. His father dies, and it's so sudden. It's just right there. And the book ends, the chapter ends just like another half dozen lines or so later. After dwelling on all of this stuff, all of this grab bag of stuff, that we're sitting there going, okay, well, what does this mean? And what does this episode mean? And why do they do this? And who is this character? And what does this have to do with that? And what is there any sense to any of it? They get to something that is recognizably human. Not the harpies, not the monsters, not the bleeding trees or anything like that. Recognizably human. The passing of your father. And Aeneas can't, or refuses to, speak about it. Now, you can look at this a couple of different ways. He could be just being tactful and saying, well, that was my personal concern, and you don't need to dwell on that. Again, he is all business. He is all mission-driven. Or maybe he just can't face it. Why didn't, in repeated omens and predictions and seers and oracles throughout this chapter, no one said, oh yeah, your father's about to die. Nobody picked up on that. How reliable are any of those prophecies then? If you can't see something so momentous to Aeneas and his mission right there as the loss of his father, how can you trust any of it? Maybe this is too personal for him to deal with. Maybe he can't read that element of it. Maybe he's refusing to look that closely at the death of his father, the loss of his father. It raises all these questions. We know more about Aeneas and somehow less with that information. And yet throughout, we're troubled throughout of this notion of interpretation and how should we read this? We're reading the Odyssey, we're reading the Iliad, we're reading the adventures of Aeneas over it and through it. All of these levels of interpretation, all of these omens, all of these prophecies, all of these judgments that we're making along the way. Oh, this one doesn't look quite right. This one doesn't look quite right. We could stay here, but do we really want to? And oh, this is a problem. And oh, this, that. Is there any certainty in reading? Is there any guaranteed interpretation? Is there any way to feel good about interpretation? Or is everything just random? Everything just chaos? The poem doesn't answer any of that.